And turning now to the Trump trials. It was a dramatic day in New York City civil court this afternoon, and not just because former President Trump's former fixer Michael Cohen testified against him for a second straight day. In a shocking moment, former President Trump was actually called to take the stand himself to explain disparaging comments he made in a hallway, which the judge ruled had violated a gag order barring Mr. Trump from making personal attacks against courtroom staff. Here are those hallway comments earlier today.
This judge is a very partisan judge, with a person who's very partisan sitting alongside of him, perhaps even much more partisan than he is.
Here's what's been happening. Trump has been appearing in multiple trials: the E. Jean Carroll defamation cases, his New York criminal hush money trial, and in each one he's been pushing boundaries, testing how far he can go before judges actually enforce consequences. And judges have been warning him. In the Carroll case, Judge Lewis Kaplan told Trump directly in open court that his right to be present can be forfeited if he is disruptive. Kaplan literally said, "Mr. Trump, I hope I don't have to consider excluding you from the trial." That's a federal judge looking at a former president and current defendant and saying, "If you can't behave, I will kick you out." Not might, not could, will. And Kaplan wasn't bluffing.
Trump says Michael Cohen, but he still again said, that clerk, though, she is partisan against me. The clerk he's talking about, Gabe, is, if you remember, the very same clerk that he posted a disparaging post about that initially got the gag order placed on him. So this is a second time that he's pushing that same button on this judge. And it seemed like the judge simply said he had enough. He said he found Trump not credible on the stand and said he was fining him $10,000. Then the cross-examination continued after the judge said, look, don't do it again. Next time it'll be worse. The cross continued. Then Trump's attorney asked for a directed verdict in the case, which essentially means he asked the judge to dismiss the case because of something that Michael Cohen.
He was making it clear that Trump's status as a former president doesn't give him special privileges in the courtroom, that he's subject to the same rules as any other defendant, and if he violates those rules, he faces the same consequences, including being physically removed. And in the New York criminal trial, Judge Juan Merchan dealt with similar issues. Trump kept testing the gag order. He'd post things on social media that skirted right up to the edge of what was prohibited. He'd attack witnesses and court personnel in ways that were clearly designed to intimidate, but arguably didn't technically violate the exact wording of the order. CNN and other outlets described Trump's behavior as walking up to the line and stomping on it. He wasn't accidentally crossing boundaries. He was deliberately taunting judges, daring them to hold him in contempt, seeing how far he could push before they actually did something. And Judge Merchan responded with escalating warnings. First, he issued the gag order. Then, when Trump violated it, Merchan held him in contempt and fined him. Then, Merchan warned that if the violations continue, he would consider incarceration. That's a judge telling the President of the United States that he could be jailed for contempt, not as some distant theoretical possibility, as an immediate threat if Trump keeps pushing. Now, here's what makes this so significant. There are actual legal mechanisms for removing Trump from court, and those mechanisms are backed by the U.S. Marshal Service. Federal judges can issue contempt orders, and when they do, U.S. Marshals enforce them. That's their job. They act at the direction of federal courts. So if a judge says Trump is in contempt and orders him removed from the courtroom, marshals don't debate it. They don't ask for permission from the White House. They enforce the court's order, they approach Trump, they tell him he's being removed. And if he refuses to leave voluntarily, they physically remove him. That could mean grabbing his arms and escorting him out. That could mean handcuffing him if he resists. The marshals have the authority to use whatever force is necessary to enforce the judge's order. And Trump can't stop them, because in a courtroom, the judge is in charge. Not the president, not the defendant, the judge. So Trump is playing a very dangerous game. He thinks he can keep pushing because judges have been reluctant to actually remove a former president from court. He thinks his status gives him leverage, that judges won't want the spectacle of having him dragged out. But judges are making it clear that his status doesn't matter, that if he can't control himself, if he keeps violating orders, they will use their authority. And when they do, it will happen suddenly. A surprise contempt ruling, marshals approaching Trump, and before he can even react, he's being escorted out of his own trial. And that moment, that image of Trump being physically removed from court would be absolutely devastating to his strongman image, because it would show everyone that for all his bluster, for all his claims of power, he's still subject to the rule of law, that courts can still control him and there's nothing he can do about it. All right, so let's dig into exactly what judges have warned Trump about and how close he's come to being removed from court. Okay, so let's walk through the specific warnings Trump has received from judges, because these aren't vague suggestions. These are explicit threats about what will happen if Trump doesn't control himself. And understanding these warnings shows just how close Trump has come to being physically removed from court. So, we'll start with Judge Lewis Kaplan in the Eugene Carroll case. This was a federal defamation trial. Carroll was suing Trump for defaming her after she accused him of sexual assault. And Trump showed up for part of the trial, which was unusual because he'd skipped a lot of other court appearances. But he wanted to be there for this one, probably to try to intimidate Carroll or make some kind of statement. But his behavior in court was problematic. He was making audible comments during testimony, shaking his head, making faces, basically trying to disrupt the proceedings without technically doing anything that would get him immediately removed. And Judge Kaplan had enough. He called Trump out in open court. Kaplan said that Trump's right to be present at the trial can be forfeited if he is disruptive. And then Kaplan looked directly at Trump and said, "Mr. Trump, I hope I don't have to consider excluding you from the trial." That's a federal judge giving a direct warning to a former president, not a gentle reminder, a warning, saying, "If you keep this up, I will remove you." Now think about what that moment must have been like. Trump is used to dominating every room he's in. He's used to being the center of attention, being the one in control. But in that courtroom, Judge Kaplan was in charge. And Kaplan was making it clear that Trump's status didn't matter, that he would be treated like any other disruptive defendant. And if he couldn't control himself, he'd be kicked out. Now Trump apparently took that warning seriously, because after Kaplan said that, Trump's behavior in court became more subdued. He stopped making audible comments. He sat more quietly. And eventually, he walked out on his own during the plaintiff's closing argument, rather than risk being removed by the judge. So Kaplan's warning worked. But it also established something important, that federal judges are willing to threaten Trump with removal, that they're not going to give him special treatment just because he was president, and that the threat of being physically excluded from his own trial is real, not hypothetical, not something that might happen in extreme circumstances, something that could happen if Trump pushes too far. Now, let's talk about Judge Juan Machon in the New York criminal trial. Because Machon dealt with a different kind of disruptive behavior from Trump. Trump wasn't making outbursts in court. Instead, he was violating the gag order. Machon had imposed a gag order prohibiting Trump from attacking witnesses, court personnel, prosecutors, and jurors. Standard protective order in a high-profile case. But Trump kept testing it. He'd post on Truth Social about witnesses. He'd attack the judge's daughter. He'd make comments that skirted the edge of what was prohibited. And Merchant responded with escalating consequences. First, Merchant issued warnings, told Trump to stop, explained what the gag order prohibited. But Trump kept violating, so Merchant held him in contempt. 9 violations, $1,000 fine for each one, $9,000 total. Now Trump doesn't care about $9,000. He probably spends more than that on a golf weekend. But the contempt finding was significant because it established that man was willing to use his authority, that he would hold Trump accountable for violations. But here's where it gets really serious. After holding Trump in contempt and finding him, Merchant issued a warning about what comes next. He said that if Trump continues to violate the gag order, the court will have to consider incarceration. Incarceration, that's jail. Judge Merchant was explicitly telling Trump that if he keeps violating court orders, he could be jailed, not as some distant possibility, as the next step in the escalation. And Merchant explained why. He said that monetary fines clearly aren't working as a deterrent. Trump just pays them and keeps violating. So the court needs a penalty that Trump actually cares about. And that penalty is jail. Now, Merchant was careful to say this is a last resort, that he doesn't want to jail a former president and current defendant, but that he will if Trump leaves him no choice. And that threat is real, because judges have the authority to jail people for contempt. It's one of the most fundamental powers courts have. And if Trump keeps violating orders, Merchan could issue a contempt order that includes jail time, and then U.S. Marshals would enforce it. So let's talk about how that would actually work, because this isn't just theoretical. There are actual procedures for removing someone from court and enforcing contempt orders. U.S. Marshals are responsible for courtroom security and enforcement of court orders. They're present in federal courtrooms, and they act at the direction of the judge. So if Judge Kaplan or Judge Merchant issues an order to remove Trump from the courtroom, Marshals execute that order. Here's how it would happen. The judge would make a ruling. Trump, you're in contempt. You're being removed from this courtroom. And then the judge would direct the Marshals to enforce the order. The Marshals would approach Trump. They'd tell him he needs to leave. Now, if Trump leaves voluntarily, they'd escort him out. But if Trump refuses, if he says, "No, I'm not leaving, you can't make me," then the Marshals use force. They'd grab his arms, they'd physically lift him if necessary, and they'd remove him from the courtroom. If Trump actively resisted, they'd handcuff him because resisting a lawful order from a federal court is a crime in itself. And Marshals have the authority to use whatever force is necessary to enforce the court's order. Now, Trump might think he could tell the Secret Service to protect him, to stop the Marshals from removing him. But that wouldn't work because the Secret Service's job is to protect Trump from threats, not to help him defy court orders. In a situation where a federal judge has ordered Trump removed, the Secret Service would defer to the Marshals. They might coordinate to make sure the removal happens safely, but they wouldn't intervene to stop it. So Trump couldn't use his security detail to shield himself from a court order. The Marshals would remove him, and the Secret Service would step aside. And here's the thing. Once Trump is removed from the courtroom, the trial continues without him. Judges have made this clear. A defendant's right to be president at trial can be forfeited through disruptive behavior. So if Trump is removed for contempt, the prosecution keeps presenting evidence. Witnesses keep testifying. The trial moves forward and Trump doesn't get to participate. He doesn't get to hear the testimony against him. He doesn't get to consult with his lawyers about cross-examination strategies. He's just out sitting in a holding cell or in a marshal's office while his trial proceeds without him. That would be devastating both legally and politically. Now, there's been a lot of viral content about Trump being dragged from court. YouTube videos with titles like "Trump instantly removed from courtroom" or "Trump thrown out after he tries to arrest judge." And some of this content is dramatization. It's people imagining what it would look like if Trump was actually removed, taking the real judicial warnings and extrapolating them into dramatic scenes. But here's the thing. Those dramatizations are based on real legal possibilities. Judges have explicitly warned Trump that he can be removed. They've explained the procedures. They've threatened contempt. And legal experts have laid out exactly how it would work. So, while the viral videos might be exaggerated or speculative, the underlying reality is real. Trump could be physically removed from court. The legal mechanisms exist. The warnings have been issued. And Trump keeps pushing boundaries in ways that bring that possibility closer to reality. Now, let's talk about why Trump keeps doing this. Why does he keep testing judges when he knows they could have him removed? Part of it is Trump's personality. He can't help himself. He sees someone challenging his authority and he has to push back. He has to show that he's in control, that he doesn't have to follow their rules. So even when judges warn him, even when they threaten consequences, Trump's instinct is to keep pushing to see if they're bluffing, to test whether they'll actually follow through. And so far, judges have shown remarkable restraint. They've issued warnings, they've imposed fines, but they haven't actually removed Trump from court or jailed him. So in Trump's mind, that proves they won't, that the threats are empty, that he can keep pushing without real consequences. But here's what Trump is missing. Judges aren't bluffing, they're escalating. Each warning is more serious than the last. Each consequence is harsher. And at some point, Trump is going to push too far. He's going to violate an order one too many times, or he's going to have an outburst in court that crosses the line. And a judge is going to say, "That's it, I've had enough." And they're going to issue a surprise contempt order. No more warnings, no more chances. You're in contempt. Marshals, remove him. And in that moment, everything changes, because Trump won't have time to react, won't have time to walk out on his own like he did in the Carroll trial. The order will come down, marshals will move in, and Trump will be physically escorted out of the courtroom. And that image of Trump being grabbed by marshals and removed from court would be absolutely devastating to his political brand, because Trump's entire image is built on strength, on being in control, on dominating every situation. but you can't dominate a situation when federal marshals are physically removing you from court. You can't claim to be in control when a judge has ordered you excluded from your own trial. That moment would shatter the illusion. It would show that for all Trump's bluster, he's still subject to the law, that courts can still enforce consequences, that there are still institutions with authority over him, and Trump knows this. That's why after Judge Kaplan's warning, he behaved better. That's why he pays the contempt fines, even though he complains about them. Because deep down, Trump knows that if he pushes too far, judges will follow through. And being dragged out of court by marshals would be one of the most humiliating moments of his life. All right, so let's talk about what it would mean if Trump actually was removed from court, and why that possibility is a sword hanging over every trial he faces. Okay, so let's look at what it would actually mean if Trump was removed from court. Because this isn't just about one embarrassing moment. This is about the fundamental power dynamic between Trump and the legal system, and about whether courts can still enforce their authority on someone who thinks he's above the law. So let's break down why this matters. Point 1. Being dragged from court would destroy Trump's strongman image. Trump's entire political brand is built on projecting strength, on being the tough guy who doesn't back down, who dominates every confrontation, who makes other people submit to his will. And his supporters love that about him. They see Trump as someone who fights, who doesn't let anyone push him around. But if Trump gets physically removed from court by U.S. Marshals, that image collapses instantly, because there's no way to spin being grabbed and escorted out of a courtroom as strength. That's submission. That's being overpowered by authority. And Trump can't claim he chose to leave or that he walked out in protest. Everyone would see him being forced out against his will. And that visual, Trump being physically controlled by law enforcement, would be devastating. His opponents would play it on loop. Democrats would use it in campaign ads. It would become the defining image of Trump's legal troubles. Not Trump defiantly walking into court, Trump being removed from court by marshals. That's weakness, not strength. Point 2. Removal from court would have real legal consequences, because once Trump is excluded from his trial for disruptive behavior, he forfeits his right to be present, and that creates serious problems for his defense. Defendants have a constitutional right to be present at their trials, to confront witnesses, to participate in their own defense, but that right can be waived through misconduct. If you're so disruptive that the court can't function with you present, you lose the right to be there, and then the trial continues without you. So if Trump is removed, his lawyers have to proceed without being able to consult with him. They can't ask him questions during witness testimony. They can't get his input on strategic decisions. They're on their own, and that makes mounting an effective defense much harder. Plus, Trump being absent sends a terrible signal to the jury. It suggests he couldn't control himself, that he was so disruptive the judge had to remove him. That doesn't make him look innocent or sympathetic. It makes him look guilty and out of control. Point 3. The threat of removal gives judges enormous leverage over Trump. Right now, judges are using that threat to keep Trump in line. They're warning him that if he keeps pushing, they'll remove him. And Trump is responding by moderating his behavior, at least somewhat. He's not being perfectly behaved, but he's not having full-blown outbursts in court either, because he knows that if he crosses certain lines, judges will follow through on their threats. So the threat of removal is working as a deterrent. But here's the problem for Trump. That threat doesn't go away. It hangs over every courtroom appearance, every trial, every hearing. Trump has to constantly monitor his behavior. He has to think before he speaks. He has to control his reactions because one slip-up could result in a contempt order and removal. And that's exhausting. Trump isn't good at self-control. His natural instinct is to lash out when he feels attacked. But in court, he has to suppress those instincts. And the strain of doing that is probably making him miserable. Point 4. Trump being removed would set a precedent, because right now there's this question about whether courts can really enforce consequences on a former president. Trump has been testing that, pushing boundaries to see if judges will actually treat him like a normal defendant. And so far, judges have been cautious. They've issued warnings, they've imposed fines, but they haven't taken the ultimate step of physically removing him or jailing him. So there's still uncertainty about whether they would actually do it. But if a judge does remove Trump from court, that settles the question. It establishes that yes, courts can and will enforce consequences on former presidents who misbehave. That presidential status doesn't give you immunity from contempt. And once that precedent is set, it becomes easier for other judges to do the same thing. They can point to the first removal and say, This has been done before. We know it's lawful. We're doing it again. So Trump being removed once could lead to it happening multiple times across different cases. And each time it happens, it reinforces that Trump is subject to court authority like anyone else. So what happens next? First, watch Trump's behavior in ongoing and future trials, because every court appearance is a potential flashpoint. If Trump has a bad day, if something in the testimony particularly angers him, if he feels the judge is being unfair, he might snap. He might have an outburst or violation serious enough that a judge issues an immediate contempt order and has him removed. So each trial is a risk. And the more trials Trump faces, the higher the odds that one of them results in him being dragged out. Second, watch for surprise contempt orders, because judges might not give Trump additional warnings. They might decide he's had enough warnings already, and the next violation results in immediate contempt. So Trump could think he's still in the warning phase, still has room to push, and suddenly a judge drops a contempt order and marshals are approaching him. That's the surprise order scenario. No advance notice, no final warning, just immediate enforcement. Third, watch whether Trump's lawyers can control him, because his legal teams have to be terrified of Trump being removed from court. It makes their jobs much harder. So they're probably constantly coaching Trump on courtroom behavior, telling him what he can and can't do, trying to keep him calm. But Trump doesn't always listen to his lawyers. He thinks he knows better. So there's a real possibility that Trump ignores his lawyers' advice and does something that gets him removed, despite their efforts to prevent it. And fourth, watch how the public and media react if Trump is removed, because that would be a massive story. Cable news would cover it nonstop. Social media would explode, and it would dominate the news cycle for days or weeks. So judges know that removing Trump isn't just a courtroom matter, it's a national event, and they're probably factoring that into their calculations about when and whether to do it. Here's the bottom line. Trump has been warned repeatedly by judges that he can be physically removed from court if he doesn't control himself. Judge Kaplan told him his right to be present can be forfeited. Judge Merchant threatened jail for continued gag order violations, and legal mechanisms exist for U.S. Marshals to enforce these orders. So the threat is real. Trump could be grabbed by marshals and escorted out of his own trial, and that could happen suddenly, a surprise contempt order followed by immediate removal. No time for Trump to leave voluntarily, just marshals approaching and physically removing him. And when that happens, not if, but when, because Trump can't control himself indefinitely, and it will be devastating. The image of Trump being dragged from court will destroy his strongman brand. It will show that courts still have authority over him, that he's still subject to the rule of law, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. So Trump is walking a tightrope in every courtroom, trying to push boundaries without crossing the line that gets him removed, testing judges to see how far he can go. But judges are running out of patience. Their warnings are getting more serious. The threats of removal are getting more explicit. And at some point, Trump is going to push too far. He's going to have that one outburst or violation that makes a judge say, enough. And when that order comes down, when marshals move in, Trump's going to learn what every other defendant already knows, that in a courtroom, the judge is in charge, not you. And if you can't follow the rules, you get removed, whether you're a former president or not. All right, that's where we are. Trump has been explicitly warned that he can be removed from court. The legal mechanisms exist. U.S. Marshals would enforce it. And Trump keeps pushing boundaries in ways that make it more likely to happen. You know, this isn't speculation. This is judges telling Trump directly what will happen if he crosses the line, and Trump testing whether they'll follow through. Make sure you're subscribed, because when a judge finally issues that surprise contempt order and Trump gets dragged from court, it's going to be one of the most dramatic moments in legal history. Hit that notification bell, join the newsletter, because we're tracking every warning, every violation, every step closer Trump gets to that moment.